Hello and welcome to ChinnyVision. This time some SNES action with the Super Everdrive. For those of you who keep an eye on the retro gaming scene prices, you'll know that SNES games that were once expensive are now super expensive, especially when you compare them to the Sega scene where Mega Drive and Master System games are very much affordable. Indeed, for this channel, I've not actually bought a SNES game in well over a year because, frankly, on the budgets I'm working on, it just doesn't work out in terms of buying cartridges you can for the Master System or Mega Drive. When you look at SNES games, it's just not affordable. So for Christmas, I asked Mrs. Chinny for a Super Everdrive for my SNES so that I can actually play some of the games I've never been able to afford. Christmas morning, and I unwrapped a Super Everdrive cartridge, very pleased with it, and started to use it. And the first thing that struck me was there were no instructions with it. In fact, there was no packaging at all. It was just a cartridge. And I did ask Mrs. Chinny about this, and she said, no, it just came in a padded envelope with nothing else. So I thought, well, this has to be fairly simple. So I copied a load of ROMs onto my SD card, plugged it in, and thought, this would work. Nope. So then started rooting around online, went to the retailer, which was Retro Tower's website, had a look on there, no instructions on there, and then actually managed to find some instructions on a rival retailer's website. So downloaded all the firmware, which, okay, is fair enough, and then loaded it onto my SD card. Still didn't work. Eventually I worked out I needed to format the SD card as FAT32, copied my firmware into the appropriate directory and copied the games onto the thing, and then it finally did work. So my first impressions of the device weren't exactly good. Why, when a device costs £70, $69.99, isn't a SD card bundled with the device? Now, it is an optional extra available from Retro Towers for £10, but I assume that's a blank SD card. It might come with the firmware. But, really, an 8GB SD card costs about £4.20 on Amazon, far less if you're buying them wholesale. So, that kind of price, and when you're paying £70 for something, why isn't an SD card bundled in? Indeed, I've seen some other retailers that do exactly that. They bundle in the SD card with the firmware and the games to boot, which just makes it that little bit easier. Again, this is a £70 device, so wasn't too impressed. So it's not as simple as copying your games just onto a card and just copying the firmware of the games onto the card. You've got to get everything right, and there were no instructions. But what do you get for your £70? Well, you get an SD card adapter for your SNES that can play any SNES game providing it doesn't use enhancement chips. Now, and that means about 70 games that you can't play. Not a major problem, actually. Having looked through the list on Wikipedia of all the SNES games that use enhancement chips, the 4 that jumped out at me were Pilot Wings, Super Mario Kart, Star Fox, and Doom. Well, Pilot Wings, Super Mario Kart, and Star Fox are actually fairly affordable because they're incredibly common cartridges, so it isn't a huge problem. And Doom, well, why bothering playing it on a SNES, really? I mean, come on, you're going to play that on a PC, aren't you? A pimped up PC, nice and smooth, full screen. Yeah, that's where the action's at. There are, as I say, about 70 games you can't play, but have a look at that Wikipedia page. I'll scroll some of the games past now on this review, but none of them particularly bothered me, so I can still play the rest of the SNES library. The cartridge itself is available in grey or black, although when mine was ordered, only the black one was available. In fact, I would prefer black. Looks like the Star Fox cartridge. So you insert your SD card in the top of the cartridge into a slot. These are original cartridges, I think, and a slot has been cut in the top. And I came across the first problem when I was recording this because the SD card didn't go in straight and fell inside the cartridge. I couldn't get it out with tweezers. Eventually I had to undo the cartridge to extract the SD card. So it at least gives us a chance to look at the hardware inside the cartridge. You can see a big FPGA and some flash memory. And when I came to put it back together, I noticed the top 2 screws didn't go in very well. In fact, they'd been quite tight when I'd undone them. Now, anyone who knows about 1980s and 90s plastics knows that when you do these things up, as they would have had to have done when they put the card inside this old cartridge, you don't over tighten. And evidently those two screws at the top have been over tightened, because when I put them back in, there was no bite at all. So I had to do the old trick with a dab of hot glue on both pillars, and then when that dried, that gave a little bit of bite for the screws so it could be done back up again. But again, that should never have happened. That should never have been over tightened when it was done up in the first place. So the interface, once you've got a working SD card, it's fairly straightforward to use. You click on a game, you use left and right to go between screens. You can't just scroll down and keep on scrolling through your list. When you reach the bottom of the page, for some reason, you've got to press right to go to the next page of games. Bit counterintuitive. Why can't I just scroll down like every other SD card device? Bit odd. You select the game and then you've got a little bit of a wait, because what this device does is it copies from the SD card to a rewritable ROM, or some emulation of a rewritable ROM, on the card that then appears as a ROM to the SNES. So first of all, it has to erase itself, and then it will copy from the SD card to the ROM, which can take a little bit of time. If it's one of the smaller SNES games, it's done in about 5-10 seconds, something like that. If it's one of the larger games, and the games can go up to 48 megabits, so that's what the thing supports, you've got quite a wait around. It's not instant, although if you reset the SNES, the thing retains the image in memory. It's only if you turn the SNES off that it erases and you start again. Speaking of switching the SNES off, there are dire warnings on the interface about not switching the power off when it's doing the transfer. Now, this is all very well, but what happens if there's a power cut or some inadvertent power outage? What damage is going to be caused, and what is the recovery process? Again, no instructions, so I've got no idea. You've just got to hope that the power doesn't cut while you're doing that critical transfer from the SD card to the internal ROM. When it's working, the machine's absolutely fine. I've played a load of games I couldn't possibly afford on cartridge, and they all work perfectly. It's only when you've got the enhancement chips, and I have tested Star Fox and it doesn't even load. It just copies into memory and you get a black screen when you try and load the game up. If you do want to use enhancement chips on your SNES, then you need a thing called an SD2 SNES, which costs an eye-watering £149. £149! That's an astonishing amount of money. Oh, dear me. The cartridge has some special features up its sleeve as well. It's got 32k of RAM to store save games. You can add updates via the SD card, although that's pretty obvious because I had to load the firmware onto the SD card to begin with. It supports up to 32 gig SD cards, and dire warning here, team, to quote TreyGuard, don't copy your entire SNES ROM library onto the SD card. The entire thing will be reduced to an absolute crawl when you're going through the menus. Just copy on the ones you need. I made that mistake. It's not one I'm going to repeat. The less images you have on the SD card, the faster the interface works. So just copy on the ones you need. Speaking of the SD card slot on the device, I found it a little bit fiddly. Now, it's a little bit annoying to get the card in and out. You need to use your fingernails to really grip it and pull it out. It's a non-clicky type of SD card slot, which really annoys me on these devices. And we all know what the clicky SD card slots feel like. You press your SD card in, it clicks, you press it again, it pops out slightly, then you can extract it. This is the cheaper type of slot. It's the one where you put it in, it doesn't click, you've got to make sure it's got contact, and then you gently prise it out again. Don't like those slots. I've got problems with this kind of thing on my Div MMC Enjoy, where I'm taking my SD card in and out all the time to load in games onto the Spectrum. And after a while, it becomes a little bit loose, and sometimes you're not getting good contact. Really don't like them. It's the kind of thing that costs 5p extra in manufacturing, not even that. And yet somebody decides to penny pinch and not put that type of slot on there. Again, this device costs £70, and that is just corner cutting at the manufacturing stage. Those small details make a device feel like a quality device to a device that feels a little bit cheap. And again, if this cartridge was cheaper, it wouldn't bother me, but it's £70. So what does the Super Everdrive V2 do for your SNES? Well, it enables you to run all but 70 Super Nintendo games via SD card, which will save you a fortune trying to buy cards such as Parodius and other more expensive cartridges. You can literally play everything. Yes, there are 70 games you can't play, but really looking at that list, it doesn't bother me in particular. Yes, the device is £70, which is quite expensive, especially when there were no instructions or packaging with it. An included SD card would have helped soften the blow. I don't like the SD card slot. Even before I had the problem with the SD card falling inside the cartridge, it was fiddly to get in and get out. Trying to grip it just to pull it out was a little bit difficult. It should have been a clicky SD card slot in there like you see on other devices such as the SD2 IEC on the Commodore 64. You click it in with a press, you press it again, it pops out. The kind of thing that costs a few pence extra in manufacturing and just makes it feel like a more of a quality device. And I simply should not be able to lose my SD card inside the slot. A little bit of foam or plastic or something would stop that happening, but no, it's just a slot, and if you're not careful and you miss that SD card slot adapter, your card will fall inside the cartridge. Overall, the device is worth having because it's going to save you a fortune on buying those cartridges, but I would hope that perhaps other people can come along and bust the market open like has happened on the Commodore 64 and produce more affordable SD card solutions for the SNES.